Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the life of a man who was, quite literally, a force of nature. We're talking about a historical figure who started with next to nothing, blew through Europe like a hurricane, and ended his days completely isolated on a tiny rock in the ocean. I am talking, of course, about Napoleon Bonaparte. We're going to trace his entire journey today, looking at his mind-blowing military victories, his absolute disasters, and those wild, lingering conspiracy theories surrounding his death. Let's get right into it. So, here is our roadmap for This Explainer. 1. The outsider rises. 2. Mastering the art of war. 3. The disastrous Russian campaign. 4. Waterloo and the fall. And finally, number 5. Exile, death, and conspiracies. Starting off with Section 1, The Outsider Rises. Now, when you hear the name Napoleon, you probably immediately think of France, right? But actually, his story kicks off on the Mediterranean island of Corsica. Get this, he didn't even learn to speak French until he was 9 years old, and he always spoke with a really heavy accent. Which brings us to a super fascinating question. How exactly did an awkward outsider conquer Europe? See, at his fancy French military academy, he was relentlessly bullied. He was small, he was a foreigner, and he was pretty much a total loner. But as it turns out, that intense isolation was secretly forging a brilliant strategic mind that was about to completely shock the world. Okay, let's dive into the timeline here because the speed of his rise is just insane. Born in 1769, then by 1793, as just this young artillery officer, he makes a massive name for himself by winning the siege of Toulon. Fast forward a bit to November 1799, the famous 18-Brumaire coup. He completely capitalizes on all the political chaos, overthrows the government, and seizes dictatorial power as first consul. And then, boom, 1804, this former bullied kid officially crowns himself Emperor of the French. Talk about a dramatic ascent. Moving right along to Section 2, Mastering the Art of War. As emperor, he definitely modernized Europe with some huge reforms, but make no mistake, his real passion was the battlefield. To really understand his absolute tactical genius, we have to talk about the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. He was facing a combined Russian and Austrian army that totally outnumbered him. But consider the aftermath. Out of an 89,000-strong Allied army, they suffered a devastating 38% casualty rate. Meanwhile, the French lost only about 13%. So you have to ask yourself, how on earth did Napoleon pull off such a massively lopsided victory against two giant empires? Well, he basically set this brilliant, giant psychological trap for Tsar Alexander I and the Austrians. First up, Napoleon plays weak. He literally asks for peace talks and voluntarily gives up the high ground, the Pratzen Heights. Second, he deliberately weakens his right flank, basically dangling a carrot, baiting the Allies to attack it so they'd overextend themselves. And then step 3, while the Allies are completely distracted taking the bait, he launches a massive, hidden surprise attack right up the middle to take back the heights. And he does it all perfectly cloaked by the thick morning mist. It was an absolute masterclass in deception. As the sun, what became known as the legendary Sun of Austerlitz, burned through that mist and exposed the weak Allied center, Napoleon turned to his marshals and said, "One sharp blow, and the war is over." And man, he was absolutely right. The French forces just shattered the Allied lines, slicing their army right in two. This single, decisive victory was so massive, so profound, that it actually forced the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire to completely dissolve. Just incredible. Which brings us to Section 3, the disastrous Russian campaign. By 1812, Napoleon's empire was absolutely huge. But trying to enforce a trade embargo against Britain, he made a fateful and, honestly, deeply overextended decision to invade Russia. To pull this off, he assembled this completely unprecedented multinational force, 685,000 men, the Grande Armée. It was a staggering number of people. Confident, feeling basically invincible, this massive wave of humanity crossed into Russia fully expecting a quick surrender. But the Russians, they refused to play his game. They just kept retreating, burning their own lands to the ground as they went. And the numbers brilliantly illustrate just how catastrophic that campaign really was. They went from a peak force of 685,000 soldiers down to a surviving, returning force of just 93,000 men. The French actually did manage to capture Moscow, but when they got there, the city was totally abandoned and on fire. Napoleon waited around for a surrender that simply never came, and he delayed his retreat until October. And that decision, right there, that ultimately sealed their fate. The wild thing is, it wasn't even necessarily the Russian army in pitched battles that destroyed the Grande Armée. It was the elements and disease. As supply lines totally collapsed, the retreating soldiers were decimated by severe starvation and exhaustion. They were being ravaged by typhus and these awful lice-borne diseases. And then the unforgiving continental winter set in. Frost and snow froze tens of thousands of men to death right in their tracks. Plus, the whole time, they were dealing with relentless hit-and-run harassment by Cossack cavalry and local partisans. It was a complete and utter disaster. Moving to Section 4, Waterloo and the Fall. Let's see how this builds, because that disaster in Russia was basically blood in the water. It sparked a brand new coalition that invaded France and actually forced Napoleon to surrender. So, April 1814, he abdicates and gets exiled to the tiny island of Elba. But hey, you can never truly count him out. Less than a year later, he pulls off a remarkable escape. He lands in France, and royalist troops are sent to arrest him. He just walks right up to their muskets and challenges them to shoot their emperor. Instead, they literally shout "Vive l'Empereur" and rally to his side. This kicks off a brief comeback known as the 100 Days, culminating in June 1815 with the ultimate showdown, the Battle of Waterloo. The British commander at Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington, famously summed up the battle with this quote, "The nearest run thing you ever saw in your life." And it really, really was. For hours, these two massive armies just battered each other, and Napoleon came incredibly close to breaking the British lines. But late in the day, delayed Prussian forces finally arrived to back up Wellington. It was just too much. For the first time ever, Napoleon's legendary Imperial Guard broke and retreated, which definitively brought his empire crashing down. Which leads us into Section 5, Exile, Death, and Conspiracies. After Waterloo, the British were definitely not about to make the same mistake twice. They needed to put Napoleon somewhere he could never, ever escape from. So they picked this desolate volcanic rock called St. Helena. He was exiled roughly 1,000 miles off the African coast, totally stripped of power, and guarded by over 2,000 soldiers in this terribly humid climate. In this miserable environment, he spent his final years completely isolated, dictating his memoirs to try and shape his legacy, and constantly complaining about his rapidly failing health. Now, all that intense isolation helped fuel a historical mystery that we're still talking about today. In his final will, which he dictated right before he died on May 5th, 1821, he actually wrote, "I die prematurely, murdered by the English oligarchy and its hireling." I mean, a dramatic statement like that, coming from one of history's most famous commanders, it immediately sparked explosive rumors and wild conspiracy theories about what really killed him. And the historical debate over his death is still raging. If you look at the official autopsy, it claimed he died of a severe stomach ulcer. Modern medical experts actually think that was probably made way worse by his own doctor, who was prescribing massive doses of this incredibly potent laxative called calomel. But here's the kicker. That very same doctor gave at least 3 completely different versions of the autopsy report over the years. So naturally, the conspiracy theories lean super heavily into the idea of poisoning. And you can see why. It was fueled by Napoleon's own provocative words, plus the fact that the British government obviously had a massive motive to make absolutely sure he never disturbed the peace of Europe again. So what does this all mean? It leaves us with a pretty profound final question. Was Napoleon Bonaparte a modernizing, visionary genius who completely reshaped European law and society? Was he a megalomaniacal dictator who gladly sacrificed millions of lives just for his own personal glory? Or was he simply a victim of his own totally boundless ambition? His legacy is, without a doubt, one of the most deeply polarizing in all of human history. I highly encourage you to keep exploring the source materials and decide for yourself. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking questions.